I was just picturing the people who wanted to hear about Buddhism in the first episode, and we're like, oh, when are they going to talk about Buddhism? So, they had a second episode so they can talk about Buddhism. Maybe I'll just add in the Buddhist character. I've inserted Buddhist koans as commentary to all that's been said so far in the episode. And still have this voice.
What voice?
You can never walk through the same river twice.
What the hell is wrong with you?
We don't do enough voices on the show, I realize. I keep meaning to do them for the intro, but then it comes at me too fast.
I did listen to some of these comedy podcasts, like Doug Benson's Doug Loves Movies. Have you guys ever listened to that?
Nope.
It's highly entertaining. And he had a guy on who does Jesse the Body Ventura as the conspiracy theorist governor. That's a good voice. Now, if I could do that, that would be worth doing. Do any of you guys even know who Jesse the Body Ventura is?
I know exactly who Jesse the Body Ventura is.
That's right. He was governor of your state.
No,
home state, right?
The next door state.
Oh, Minnesota. Okay.
Yep.
Not Michigan. And they all start with M.
Speaking of podcasts, because we essentially scheduled this interview with Owen twice, so I spent 2 different couple-week periods listening to a bunch of Buddhist podcasts to get myself in the mood, to see what the realm of stuff out there was, and so we didn't sound completely clueless or out of touch with what people were talking about in Buddhism. For instance, Buddhist Geeks has been recommended to us a few times. Anybody listen to that? It's a pretty good one. I mean, it sounds like it should be plural geeks, but it seems like it was plural, and now it's mostly a couple hundred episodes in. One guy interviewing different people every week, and he's a good interviewer. It's pretty organized. They have an actual conference that they advertise very regularly, show up in person and get all these academics involved. And it's really like a very wide swath of what people are doing in Buddhism. But it also seems a little bit, it's kind of get the guest on and let him say what he wants to say. Not quite a conversation in the way, say, Conversations from the Pale Blue Dot is a conversation where the host has read all the books of the guests and is engaging them on detailed points. It's a pretty wide range of stuff. They had Stephen Batchelor, is a Buddhist skeptic, more along the lines of where Owen's coming from, who's been on that podcast, as well as the Secular Buddhist podcast that Owen was on. And then later, the Buddhist Geeks podcast had another guy that was all about Buddhist magic. There are a few different episodes about this, but there's a whole strain in Buddhism that thinks if you don't believe in ESP, you haven't been paying attention to the research. And so it was a little uncritical, can I say? I don't know. It seemed like it deserved a little stronger response. So in this particular one, he did bring up, well, I had Stephen Batchelor and he said this was all full of crap. That was the token point of objection. It was more, hear him out. One of the things I found interesting in this whole topic, just like with the Persig, is that so much of the work people are doing is not connected to an institution, right? There are people that do go to Buddhist temples, but there are many people in America just also pursuing it on their own, much like you might pursue philosophy on your own. And it just becomes a question like, well, what, in fact, you might, if you found that, I'm not going to believe your claims unless they are validated by some authority, that's seen as a sign of weakness. No, you should be able to go in and see for yourself. And I don't know, that just means that anytime anybody makes any kind of claim, however ludicrous, that you have a responsibility to go out and independently research it. You can't take anybody's word for it. We had a similar back and forth on the blog about biblical scholarship in the wake of our God episodes of people who think that the resurrection historically happened versus those who think that's just obviously a bunch of nonsense. Like, well, how many sources do I have to read? And is there anybody actually writing objectively about this before I can have an educated opinion?
The problem is this is the way conspiracy theories and people who are always complaining about how no one ever pays attention. To me, the big flag is when most of the time is spent talking about how everybody's ignoring me or ignoring this person or this idea that I love, rather than talking about what is actually being said. It's all constantly persuasive speech, and it all is linchpin kind of speech. If you just knew and understood X, you would understand everything. If you just knew and had read Process and Reality, then you would know everything. If you would just read Ayn Rand, Fountainhead, everything would be clear to you. You can pick your favorite crazy person and put it in there.
Yeah. So one of the Buddhist Geeks episode was the guy that was like, it's not confirmed with scientific precision, but there's strong evidence that there is reincarnation. There's all these cases that have been reported by this University of Virginia researcher about little children who suddenly have all these memories of specific people in different times and places. And then you look them up and those people actually were there. And can't I just discount this without actually finding out what the fuck research he's talking about and looking it up. And I'm sure there is a guy that did this research but is there anybody that seriously engages him and refutes him? Or does everybody just say, no, that's obvious bullshit? It just becomes very tiring. I want authorities to tell me what to believe.
Yeah, and if you're operating on a naturalistic, from that framework, which most of us are, then it takes extraordinary kind of evidence for us to admit that something supernatural has occurred, right? You want to say that something that transcends nature has occurred, then I'd better see it with my own eyes, and I'd better not be drunk or on drugs and so on and so forth.
But when would that be?
Some guy writing something on the internet, it's a whole different thing. Or even if he's published articles, I don't know in what journals, but right, our burden of evidence, our burden of proof is going to be high.
And that's, I think, why Flanagan, when he's arguing for naturalism, again, maybe it's just in this book, like he said, because he's already argued in past books, but he just pretty much says, we're just in the naturalist camp.
Yeah, and
this is just the set of assumptions we start with. I'm not going to bother to argue with you, people that really take rebirth seriously.
Did he imply that he argues for naturalism in some other book? I don't remember. He might actually argue for naturalism somewhere else, but in this, yeah, he just says, yes, we're going to take this for granted. And by that, he means, right, he's not admitting anything supernatural. He's not admitting miracles or anything like that, which is a little bit different than what we usually mean when we talk about moral naturalism versus moral non-naturalism, right? Because, Mark, you brought up G. Moore, and G. Moore, that's an extension of Hume's ought is distinction. Flanagan doesn't really address that. He doesn't really address whether he thinks that an ought can be derived from an is. That's one project for naturalizing morality, is to say we can get from some set of facts which don't assume any normative claim to a normative claim. That's an ongoing dispute, but Flanagan isn't really touching on that here.
That's right, Wes. That's not the way he approached it. When I asked, why do you need to have some kind of system? Like, what's the motivation for the book to begin with? And he said, well, he felt that scientific naturalism should have a metaphysics, an epistemology, and an ethics, which was a very interesting thing to say, I thought, suggesting that scientific naturalism is a kind of systematic theory, like the theories that are put forth in other philosophers, and so it needs to have the three key philosophical elements in it. But I also think there's a kind of, in two stages, one being political and one being, I'll call it nostalgic, that people who buy into scientific naturalism, who are not scientists, who aren't really thinking about the bigger questions but are just doing science, they want to have the same kind of grounding or some kind of solid foundation for ethics and for metaphysics that they get out of scientific inquiry. That, I think, is somehow left over. It's part of this nostalgia for a way of thinking that I think in philosophy has, I don't know if it's gone out of style, but it certainly was broken down in the 20th century. And the second part of it is the scientific naturalists, for the most part, are setting themselves up in the atheist camp against, I guess I'll call them religionist or theists or what have you. And so this, even though it's not obvious, is part of that whole dialogue with the new atheists that we had the podcast on a little while ago. And Flanagan is, in his own way, trying to support the claims of the atheists who are aligned with the scientific naturalism against the religious camp who's saying that science provides no basis for morality. Because you remember the term he used, that if you aren't aligned with a religion, you have to come up with some way to convince people of your moral seriousness. When people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, it's a marker that says, oh, well, I'm very serious about ethics and morality. I'm not a complete relativist or hedonist or anything like that. So I think there's some weird dynamics at play in the motivations for this book.
I think you're right, Seth, to point out that a lot of the underlying argument is to do with relativism and saying that, well, there must be some kind of standards. And those standards, we must be able to appeal to them in some way other than it being completely up to us individually, utterly relativistic. And I think you're right that there is a strand of people who see science as providing that. And I think that there's a history in science as thinking that it does. But I think even in the recent understanding of science, the way in which science would provide that kind of foundation, if you look at it at all, is so loose as to not be the kind of prescriptive rulemaking that people want to have, especially in morality or in ethics. Almost anything, or if I say anything in science, you could just revise it away into something different. And it's not that it would disappear, it's just the way in which it's a foundational item has to do with the way it's integrated with itself. And things come and go all the time in science. And the things that have stuck around, even in modern science, are pretty loose in some way. I mean, they're very abstract epistemological things. And if you say, well, energy is conserved, that's a way of just embracing the whole so that you can say, well, there's one thing I'm talking about, and that's the universe. And the only way I can measure it is by saying that there's something I can measure it with respect to. And the moment that you find out that energy, well, that might not be conserved, you end up saying, well, actually it is, because I'm going to have to come up with a new kind of energy. And that's because you were using energy as a way of describing a whole. You're trying to find something to measure with respect to. Even if it turned out that that thing that you called energy before, mv squared, ended up not being it, you would find something else that would do that for you. And I think that people have extrapolated that often into something that is intrinsic in some ways, that gives us a hold on the world that is not combined with our own interaction with it.
So for Flanagan, right, he's a naturalist in the broad sense, which is to say he thinks that the natural sciences are a paradigm for truth-seeking, and he thinks that supernatural explanations should be rejected. But that's not to say that he's on the Sam Harris route, where he thinks that empirical science is the methodology for answering all questions, say ethical questions. Now, I think he thinks it should be pushed to the limit in assisting ethical inquiry. From his book and what he said about scientism in the last podcast, I think he's aware of the possibility that the domain of sciences is limited to some extent. So when he uses naturalism in this book, I think he's using it in a very broad sense. And I think most of us would admit to being that kind of naturalist. The stronger type of naturalism is more up for debate, the deriving odds from is or the Sam Harris sort of thing.
And I think that the way Flanagan wants to use supernatural probably doesn't disagree with the way most people who would adhere to supernatural explanations would understand supernatural.
No, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Meaning that somebody who argues for ESP or karma strongly understood, or reincarnation strongly understood, they would understand that as supernatural. That's the way they would understand it themselves. I think they would, at least.
Yeah, which is to say there aren't natural laws that allow us to explain these phenomena. These phenomena break the rules, right? The ordinary rules.
Yeah, which already is a funny separate thing, right? That you would have rules for the universe that break the rules for the universe that aren't part of the bigger set of rules. It's the reason why magic is already always science. You can go to school at Hogwarts and you can learn how to do magic. So it's a science. It's not magic in the sense of... I mean, it is.
That's interesting, because my problem with Harry Potter is that it's hard to have something be at stake when you don't really know what the rules are. You never really quite know what the rules are with the magic that's involved. You know he's going to wave his wand and say some spell, but you have no way of predicting the battle based on who's got the stronger spell. You're really just not aware enough of the rules for enough to be at stake for me. So,
well, if you would keep up with the rules of wand ownership, then...
But then, you're right. But then something like, other movies play with the concept of magic as well, like, say, a movie like Mission Impossible or any hero movie where these guys are doing things which are almost impossible. I mean, these athletic feats, jumping out of windows or fighting with some guy on a moving airplane or something ridiculous like that, James Bond or Mission Impossible. So we get the thrill of it's almost supernatural, and yet they're always playing within the rules, right? There's always some plausible explanation. Okay, yes, that is possible that he could do that. And that always keeps the stakes very high in those movies. I think the stakes fall apart when things become so supernatural that you're no longer cognizant of the rules. So I think that's a good way of pointing out the difference between the natural and the supernatural.
Well, see, that's funny because it seems like Dylan was saying that in the Harry Potter movies, the magic is sort of too explained, right? Where you're saying it's not explained enough so that you understand it. Or is it just think it doesn't make sense? Like in Tolkien, for instance, it's not explained very much at all. It's just Gandalf is some sort of really a lesser god. If you read the background texts into what kind of creature he is, but even just reading the book, like there's no explanation of where this came from.
Right.
Maybe it's just that it's sprinkled so sparsely through the stories that it's not.
My point is, in a typical struggle between a protagonist and an antagonist, say it's some sort of physical struggle, you would expect that someone's going to get exhausted over the course of the fight, or you expect that a punch of a certain strength will inflict such and such kind of damage. There are all sorts of background rules like that where you're in suspense about the outcome. I mean, obviously, you know what the outcome is going to be because the good guy's going to win. And yet there's some sort of suspense about that. And often the suspense is, well, how is the good guy going to get out of this horrible predicament he's in where he's hanging off the edge of the cliff? But of course, he manages to pull the villain over the cliff and climb back up. So he's doing things which are almost impossible. So they're playing with the idea of the supernatural or the impossible, but they're just getting it in under the radar, let's say. That's where I think suspense can be created. With Harry Potter, I agree that the magic is over-explained in a way, and they try and make it mundane. You know, it's like a regular English boarding school and so on and so forth. But the fact that there's no way to follow a struggle between two magicians with wands, it's not even a narrative. There's not even a storyline to it, except that the energy is going from each wand and they're struggling with each other, and boom, suddenly one magician overcomes the other for some unknown reason. I don't know if I've explained that very well.
I think you do. I think you articulated nicely. You didn't see Rowling accomplishing that establishing of rules for magic. And I think that regardless of whether she's successful or not, she tries to do the same thing that someone like Tolkien or anybody else who deals with science fiction or supernatural events or whatever, is establish a consistency of universe so that even if you couldn't explain it, you know, you can't build the warp drive in Star Trek, but there are rules for it. There are things that can. You need dilithium crystals, right? And there's conflicts, there's lack of resources, there is limits that you run up against, all those things. And they are cause and effect, right? That's what I meant by saying that magic, in the case of Harry Potter, any of these other things, anything that you can learn ends up being a science. It would be interesting maybe to talk to somebody who really argues hardcore for supernatural explanation, yet says that you can learn something about it, and also claims that it's not a science in the sense of knowledge. I myself think that what they'll end up saying is that they want to reject a certain kind of science, but claim that learnable science for themselves. I think the only real argument against it, the only claim you could have would be something like what Lucas does with the Jedi Knights and the Mito, what are they called? The midichlorians, where you have some kind of alternative access through yourself, which works the way like something like blessedness by God, authority works. In that case, that is not learnable. It's not knowledge in the sense of a science.
Yeah, it's not replicable, and you can't get to it through an experiment. So, I mean, ironically, it's empirical to some extent, right? If someone says, well, I see ghosts, and then, you know, you could find a whole community of people who say, yes, we've all seen ghosts.
Yes. But
it's not likely that they're ever going to be able to show each other their ghosts, right? It was this very idiosyncratic, particular, walled-off experience. So they accept certain, quasi-scientific rules like the empirical thing. There's got to be something that counts as evidence, but it falls apart when you try and get the level of generalizability or rule-making. Well,
importantly, the authority for whether or not it was observed is wholly up to them and utterly individual, right?
Exactly.
But it's granted as being true. And there's something sort of powerful about that the right sort of person giving the testimony, people will believe it, right?
Right.
I think in some ways kings and leaders and stuff work this way too, that you have other reasons for placing authority in what they say, and you find yourself not judging the events yourself. You judge it based upon the authority of that experience or what you vest in that person. And that's a whole different kind of way of knowing something. It's a kind of granting of it. That's not scientific, but that's not the way magic, certainly in Harry Potter. And I don't even think that's the way magic works in Tolkien either.
What are we talking about here? How does this...
We're talking about...
midichlorians, man.
No, the reason we're talking about this was the way in which Flanagan is a naturalist and what he means by naturalism in his book on Buddhism Naturalized. And I had made the point that his way of understanding the supernatural, I thought that most people who were supernaturalists wouldn't really disagree with. And then we got on a little bit of a weird but pertinent discussion about what it would mean to have an actual supernatural claim and what kind of knowledge that would be.
Yeah, I think this is important because some people will say you want to reject karma or you want these tame interpretations of karma, luminous consciousness. You're getting rid of the most important part of this, or you're getting rid of its spiritual element, right? We can anticipate these sorts of criticisms that he sucked the soul out of Buddhism by rejecting the supernatural.
Although I like the fact that he brought in the sale of indulgences, essentially,
Right.
in that you can pay off monks to come back in a better state, that the soul has already been sucked out of the system in the culture that in which it still thrives.
Yeah, I get that. I guess the thing that's interesting to me is that there's any desire, the motivation at all, to try to use Buddhism to redeem a moral position that doesn't have the word God in it. And that's really what this comes down to, is that can't you use moral sentiment? And there's something about it's that Buddhism has a certain kind of legitimacy as a moral code without the concept of a creator God. And in that respect, that's what makes it attractive to naturalists.
It's a real form of life. It's a way people actually live these days.
As opposed to Hume and Smith's moral sentiment.
Aristotle's ethics, although people may live that way, it doesn't have a large self-designated population of Aristotelian eudaimonists, right? But Buddhism does. And so I think that's part of what attracted Flanagan and the publicity it was getting for neuroscientific verification, and the fact that he met the Dalai Lama, that would pique my interest as well. So.
Totally agree.
Yeah, it was interesting. He quoted the Dalai Lama a bunch of times in the book, that the Dalai Lama has written or dictated, I don't know, many works, and I didn't look at any of them, so I can't attest to their quality. But I think he was trying to skate a fine line in arguing against some of these points while still being respectful of this world leader that deigned to invite him to this, to get involved in this.
And you could tell, it seemed like it was important to him what the Dalai Lama specifically thought, because on the one hand, the Dalai Lama is science friendly, and I think Flanagan was heartened by that. But on the other hand, there are these certain claims about luminous consciousness that
the immaterial soul, essentially,
Flanagan rejects. Yeah, and so luminous consciousness, the idea that there can be certain kinds of conscious states that are not underwritten by neural correlates, by brain states. And that, of course, is a naturalistic no-no. That's precisely what it would mean for something to be supernatural. There'd be some entity which is not underwritten by the natural phenomena of the brain.
Yeah, and interestingly, you very quickly, at least if you've been educated in sort of the Western tradition, begin thinking about Descartes, that body-soul duality, but also about the notion of, well, how much less does a person weigh after they've died? If there is this external supra-body consciousness, you immediately think of, well, what is it made out of? If it's not made of brain or body or flesh, in order for it to be contained or exist, it has to have some kind of material manifestation.
Yeah, so that's the materialist presupposition, which is usually one of the tenets of naturalism, right?
And at the very least, if you have some respect for science and you believe in something like luminous consciousness, then you're faced with the same problem that Descartes has in, well, how does this stuff actually communicate or connect with, Descartes said, the pineal gland? And in fact, I will say the midichlorians were not in George Lucas's updated thought on what the force was. They are not the force itself. He didn't make the force into a material thing. These are things that supposedly in our cells that allow the force to communicate its will to us. So the force is still ultimately mysterious, but somehow it's supposed to help the explanation to have this thing that we've investigated and we can measure be connecting us to that. And I think once you admit something outside the natural realm, then you have to come up with this ad hoc bullshit to connect it to the natural realm somehow.
Yeah, and I have to respond to this. The most disappointing thing, and made me an ardent anti-Star Wars person. When I saw in the movie, apparently this was true early on in the books and Lucas's original conception of it, but there was nothing about this midichlorian business until whatever it was, episode 1 came out. Before then, my naive Star Trek infused interpretation was that you had access to the Force, and everyone did, like Chi or something like the Tao. Yeah, exactly. And so Yoda was well schooled in it, right? And maybe a master of it. And it was possible to be more well schooled in it and have better dispositions. But the fact that you would have to physically have more midichlorians in your blood in order to be a Jedi than someone else, all of a sudden makes all those Jedi just a different race.
Right.
Even more than that, a different being altogether, so that they become the guardians of the Force and the guardians of normal human beings. And this metaphysical presupposition is utterly in contradistinction to, like, the Star Trek universe. Now, I've revealed myself to be a tremendous geek about this. But
What are midichlorians? Or things in the blood?
They're supposed to be things in your cells, like little...
And where was this revealed that you had to have these to be a Jedi?
Well, in episode 1 it is when
they measure his blood.
Yeah, Obi-Wan's, was it Qui-Gon?
Qui-Gon
goes and
oh my God, I can't believe this is happening.
He meets the young Anakin and is so impressed, and then measures his midichlorian content and says, "Ooh, he's a Jedi waiting. We must take him away and educate him in the ways of the Force. He will be a great Jedi."
That is horrible. But those first three...
There's nothing of that about
the prequels are bad. I'm sorry. They're all bad.
Given that the science is unlimited in this universe, more or less, then wouldn't the next step to be getting like midichlorian injections and transplants and like cutting off a Jedi's head and carrying it around, and, to connect you to the...
Exactly. But of course, it would go with how much money you have, right? This is going to happen anyway.
Drinking Jedi blood.
In our world, it's going to happen anyway.
All right. So now that we've set that up, can we be similarly thoughtful evaluating basic tenets of Buddhism on naturalist grounds?
Well, in this respect, I think that for me, the most interesting part that Flanagan spent the most time on, the positive aspect of it, was the notion of emptiness, which is the part that he, for lack of a better term, meditated on himself the most and analyzed. He discounted karma. He bracketed off a whole bunch of things that he considered supernatural.
Can we just say what his tamed version of karma is?
What goes around comes around.
Things you do have effects. Yes.
What goes around comes around, buddy. That's all it is.
Even that sounds a little supernatural.
It may not come around, but it'll come to someone.
It'll come to somebody. It'll come to somebody. Yes. It won't necessarily come to you.
That's right. Yes.
But,
that's right.
Your grandchildren are going to have to deal with what you do in the world, etc.
So maybe the most tamed version of karma is there's cause and effect.
But no, he makes the point that it's more than just cause and effect, because it's the effects of sentient beings as opposed to non-sentient beings. That's what makes karmic causation different than just regular causation.
And then nirvana, the other one that he considers, do you remember what he says specifically about that? He pretty much discounts probably what should be well-established naturalistic take on mystical experience, which is, isn't it coincidental that every time a Christian has a mystical experience and thinks they're one with the universe or whatever, they see Jesus, and that a Buddhist confirm whatever religious thing that they believed in the first place. So if that's what enlightenment means, then there's not going to be much to it. But he still seems to accept nirvana as something, and this was raised by Eric in the last Buddhism discussion, Eric Douglas, that we had, that there could be just people walking around enlightened and you wouldn't even know it, because enlightenment has something to do with having a fundamental deep understanding of the truths of the creed, actually being able to see emptiness, to get rid of your habitual way of taking everything you encounter in the world as having its own inner reality. You actually see the emptiness. And so maybe that's one of the things Flanagan would allow to be, okay, you're enlightened. Is that one of the ways you could attain, I'm confusing the Satori, the enlightenment experience, with nirvana naturally, because usually you're enlightened and that's what attaining nirvana is. But then there's this other version of nirvana that he discusses, which is just after you die and you finally escape the cycle of rebirth. So that's nothingness. Right. So that's one version. I think he calls it like N1. And then another one where you actually just achieve whatever the Buddhist version of happiness is.
Right. Right.
And that's also very worldly. And so, yeah, okay, so fine, we can talk about nirvana, but it means one of those things.
Yeah, so he wants to give these tame interpretations instead of the supernatural one that implies an afterlife.
And these have got to be based on his talking to actual Buddhists. So this is within the realm of something that actual Buddhists would call nirvana or would call the enlightenment experience. But as he said, there's so many different kinds of Buddhism around.
Certainly the Dalai Lama is friendly to the more naturalistic explanations, despite the fact that they differ in the end.
It seems like he would say that most Buddhists would agree with him, but just say that he doesn't go far enough. With Flanagan, it seems to me that Flanagan, that would be his claim, is that the Dalai Lama would agree with him, except actually there's luminous consciousness. You're not going far enough at the end. Everything else is true, all that stuff about nirvana and enlightenment, but it really goes further than that.
I'm not sure I see the difference between, no, you've entirely missed the point of what enlightenment is, which I can certainly picture a lot of Buddhists listening to this. And yeah, he didn't get it. You guys don't get it. This is not what, which I don't remember who I heard saying this, but something like there are so many, particularly in America where a lot of it is third hand, whatever. There's so many different forms of Buddhism and everybody's convinced that they have the true one, so you're missing the fundamental point, the spirit of the religion, the heart of the thing.
Well, let's say what Buddhism as a natural philosophy is, because I don't think we ever gave an overview of that, right?
some of it, but it's also the Four Noble Truths that we don't need to go through in detail, but we outlined it on the other one, that the recognition that life is basically suffering. There's a lot of suffering around, and thinking that there's a way away from that we can detach from this suffering. That's not a listing of the Four Noble Truths, but that's the story.
But yeah, and that to detach from that effectively involves controlling our subjectivity in some way, or our desire, getting rid of the poisons of delusion and avarice and anger. And the way to do that is to obtain virtue, basically, or through meditation, obtain wisdom.
Not through meditation.
Meditation or mindfulness, right? Yeah. Flanagan makes the point that many Buddhists don't meditate, but meditation is one possible tool to achieve wisdom, which brings about virtue, and presumably that brings about some sort of happiness or flourishing.
What we discussed last time is it seemed like the ontological situation, this recognition of emptiness and suffering and all that stuff, is supposed to bring about virtue. In the other podcast, when we discussed this with Eric, I think we put it forward. It looked like that being virtuous was one of the things you had to do in order to get further on the path, in order to get enlightened, sort of in order to see the metaphysical truth itself. You had to engage in self-discipline, and ethical action was one way of doing that.
Interesting.
So the ought reveals the is rather than the is reveals the ought.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that kind of Aristotle's point too? Like you have to, a lot of the normative things of living according to the mean are a way of getting yourself sort of clear-headed so you can be reasonable and have the appropriate views.
Aristotle's point is that you become excellent by being excellent. That you develop the habits and you embody the virtue by acting in the way of the virtue. And that's not nonsensical. You just start doing it. And you'll be bad at it at first, and you'll get better at it.
Yeah, and Flanagan himself, for instance, talks about certain types of meditation which will help you become compassionate, for instance. He's also big on wisdom, right? Comprehension of these certain basic truths about impermanence and about the fact that we don't have a self, and emptiness they're supposed to lead to, let's say, compassion and loving kindness and these types of virtues. But it looks like also, you can directly work on compassion through meditation or mindfulness. It looks like you can skip the wisdom part to some extent.
Yeah, I think there's probably like more or less engaged in the world kind of ways of exploring this. But I thought the piece that he brought up that was most challenging is, and maybe this is the is ought and maybe it's not, but that being aware that life is suffering doesn't necessarily impel you to any specific action. So even prior to the is ought, it's not clear that awareness of the fact of the matter actually is motivation enough for you to do anything about it.
Let me just return to the Four Noble Truths, because there it seems like the ought comes straight out of the is, right? It's like you said, the first noble truth is life means suffering. The second of the origin of suffering is attachment. The third is the cessation of suffering is attainable. And the fourth is the path to the cessation of suffering. So it is, you are miserable. Everybody you know is miserable, ultimately, when you think about it. And then if you analyze the rest of that human situation, you'll see that here's some stuff you have to do for that to stop. So right there, that's the obligation. It's not, an external obligation. It's a motivator.
Can we spend a little time on this and just kind of cash it out a little bit? So when they say life is suffering, what they mean is everything in life is impermanent. It comes and it goes. And so life is a series of chasing after these impermanent things. You want happiness, you want wealth, you want joy, you want all of these things, and you experience sickness and pain and this sort of thing. But essentially, none of these things are permanent states. Like the happiness is only temporary. So suffering is related to your desire to achieve relief from the things like pain and the positive experience of things like happiness. And so suffering as attachment means that you are attached to achieving these things, these desires. Is that right?
I think so. I just was going to ask Seth, whenever I hear that word suffering, it makes me wonder about how it differs from saying that stuff happens to me.
This is a statement about your positive desires, so to speak, as opposed to the things that act upon you.
So it's not a statement saying that everyone suffers. It includes with it a value judgment rather than a notion that we are embedded. And so therefore things happen to us that are not in our control.
So you're thinking of pathos, Dylan. Is that what you're thinking of? The
well,
suffering
I guess I'm trying
being
to understand
affected?
the difference, I guess.
I think there are actually two different things at work, and I'm not 100% sure. I don't know whether the first noble truth and the second noble truth embody. So one is that life is desire. You want things. You're constantly in a state of desiring.
Yeah. I think desire is that important thing here.
Yeah, and the things that you desire are all impermanent. You think that you will be satisfied. You think that if you get money or you get that job or you have sex or what have you, that you'll be satisfied. And in fact, what you find out is that getting what you desire doesn't result in happiness. And the reason it doesn't result in happiness is because these things are impermanent and they pass. Like, to me, that's the first noble. That's how I interpret
and
it.
Also, I like the way Flanagan puts it. He uses this phrase, our desires outstrip our desiring nature. It's not just that we're in pain, but it's something about the nature of desire. And one of those things is the fact that when we desire something and we have this fantasy about it and what it's going to be like, well, by the time we get it, a lot has changed, including ourselves. And it may be that what we thought we wanted wasn't what we really wanted, or that now we've changed and we want something else. But also, even if our desire hasn't really changed, just by the passage of time, we're not the same. The person who gets what they want is not the person who wanted in the first place. Time has passed and you've become somewhat different. Or in other words, the real thing is never like the fantasy. It never lives up to that fantasy, let's say.
But isn't part of it a deeper claim about the nature of us and our desiring nature, that we run by desire? That is our directedness. Our very motion involves desiring. Without desire, we have no motion at all. And so the problem that we end up running into is once we attain the thing that we desire, if we were to cease desiring at that point, we would cease having any motion at all. Is in a way a conundrum that every time we get what we want, we need to have things we want. That's part of our nature as beings. But once we get it, unless we have something else in which to go after, then we cease being.
Yeah.
Let me make two distinctions here. So the first is, Dylan, to distinguish this desiring nature from the things that happen to us, right? So there are people that have chronic pain, that are in poverty and what have you. And the strength of this position is not that it's about alleviating suffering in the sense of external things that are perpetrated on us or that act upon us. It's dealing with this desiring nature. And the key part about dealing with the desiring nature is where it says that the origin of suffering is attachment. It's not that having a desiring nature is bad. And it's not that that's not who we are. It's that we're attached to the outcome of the desiring nature. So we think that I want this thing, and if I don't get it, I will be unhappy, or I will not be successful, or what have you. The goal is not to overcome the desiring nature. It's to overcome attachment to the outcome of the desire. You want to be desiring. You can't help it. That's what we are. But if you don't get what you desire, it's not putting a value judgment on yourself or not equating yourself with the success or failure of the outcome of the desire. So if you want to be successful and rich and you become successful and rich, you're like, hey, that's great. I'm happy. But if you were to not be successful and rich, you aren't attached to it in such a way that you become unhappy.
What is Buddhism asking of us there? I mean, Seth, you're making the argument that it's not simply asking us to give up all our desires and become completely detached, right?
No, in fact, I think that's what the Buddhists say is you can't. That's part of what being a human being is. That's what ego mind does. It craves, it searches for things. Now, their answer to it is to not be attached to the outcome. And then that ultimately plays into recognizing yourself as impermanent and there being no self. And if there's no self, then there can't be desire or attachment if there's no self. That's the leap of enlightenment or awareness that I'm not at yet. That's what I think they're trying to say. But I think they acknowledge that being human is being desiring. But the first step is to say, I will not be attached to the outcome of my desires. I want these things, but if I don't get them, I will not be miserable or unhappy. You realize that you don't have to have these things and that that's the way life is. And if you overcome that, then there's this eightfold path that takes you down this route where you can gain enlightenment. But if you make it at least through the first three noble truths, even if you don't take any concrete action, the quality of your life is theoretically going to be substantially improved.
It makes me want to think through, and this might not be exactly the place to do it, but the difference between this relationship between desiring and attachment and ultimately detachment from your desiring, that when you characterize in the end as being rooted in a kind of compassion as opposed to love, and the way that love seems to involve a kind of attachment, that part of the importance of it is that it is an attachment in the way in which that caring is different than compassion.
Yes.
So that there's something sort of at stake. Maybe this is the route you go down where you end up seeing it being a conflict between compassion and justice that Flanagan talked a little bit about at the end, that attachment might end up taking you down that road of justice.
That's a good point. I definitely think that compassion in this Buddhist sense is not what we consider to be compassion. Compassion is not empathy.
Well, there's two virtues, right? There's compassion and then there's loving kindness.
Compassion is basically recognition that what you've realized about yourself and about life and suffering, everybody else is subject to too.
And it's a desire to end the suffering of others, though.
Yes.
And then loving kindness is the positive. You want to bring happiness to others.
Yes, exactly. It's not quite compassion in the same emotional, empathetic sense that we think of it. It's more an awareness that all human beings labor under the same set of conditions and that the goal is to alleviate this attachment to desire. I won't say suffering, I'll say alleviate this attachment to the outcome of desire as much as possible.